In 1972, 8 young women boarded a monastery bus for a silent retreat in the mountains of Crescent County. They never came back. No crash, no wreckage, no answers. Then 53 years later, during the worst drought in decades, that same bus surfaced from the bottom of Morning Lake, still chained shut. And what we found inside wasn't just evidence. It was a message. Before we begin, hit subscribe to help uncover stories the church tried to bury. And make sure no silence stays sacred forever. My name is Cora Reyes. I'm 52, born and raised in Crescent County, California, about 3 hours north of Sacramento, where the forests lean in tight and the roads get quiet after sunset. I've been sheriff here going on 9 years, and before that I was deputy under a man who taught me that some truths don't need force, just patience. Back then, Crescent was a place where people didn't lock their doors unless it was hunting season. Folks knew your name at the post office, and the loudest thing you'd hear after dark was a barn owl or someone's wind chime. We were the kind of town where Sunday morning still meant church and nobody talked much about the past, especially not that past. That summer, 2025, the drought started without warning. No thunderstorms, no heat wave announcement, just dry air that got drier by the day. By early July, the reservoir feeding into St. Catherine's Lake had pulled back more than anyone remembered. The ground cracked like old skin, and you could see the lake bed begin to surface, muddy, streaked bone-dry in places that had been 10 feet under last summer. On the 5th day of that month, a local fisherman named Arlo Jesnick called it in. Said he never fished on Wednesdays, but that morning something had woken him up early, something in the air. He was casting near the south edge of the lake when his line caught something solid. When he moved in closer, he saw the roof, rounded, rusted, algae-cloaked. At first he thought it was an old van from the retreat center that used to sit up the hill. But then he saw the cross welded onto the side, faded but clear benediction order transport. I was on the scene by late afternoon, boots in the mud sun baking down. It didn't take long to confirm what we were looking at. That bus hadn't moved in over 5 decades. Its door was still chained shut from the outside. We brought in a team from the university forensic preservationists. I didn't want a single fingerprint disturbed if I could help it. And when it was time, I stepped inside first. The air hit me hard. It smelled like rust and mildew and something older like time trying to breathe again. The seats were still in place. Dust hadn't shifted. A broken mirror hung near the front, catching the light in crooked slivers. But what stopped me cold was what I found beneath the 3rd row on the left, a satchel. Leather water-warped, wrapped in wax cloth. Inside a rosary. 3 pages handwritten. 1 pressed flower. And a small journal marked Sister C. Holloway, 1972, Our Lady of the Hollow Pines. Most people in Crescent have forgotten that name, Hollow Pines, and the ones who remember don't talk about it. But I did remember, not from any official record, from a whisper. My mother went there as a postulant in the late 60s. Left after 1 year, never said why. She kept her veil folded in a cedar box under her bed like it was waiting for something. When I was 10, I once heard her whispering in her sleep. Not prayers, just names. And one stuck with me, Ciel. That name wasn't in the 1972 file. I checked. There were 8 women listed, young, all between 20 and 26. All vanished during a seasonal rite the church never explained. The official word back then was incident. That's all. No accident, no search, just gone. That night I called the diocesan archive, left a message, badge number, case file, and a quiet request. Please check for any record connected to Sister C.L. Holloway, benediction order, Crescent County, year 1972. If she wasn't supposed to be there, I'd like to know why. Outside my window, the pines barely moved. No wind, no night birds, just stillness. And somewhere under layers of old stone and silence, I felt something shift, like a breath being drawn in. When the sun came up the next morning, I was already standing at the edge of Morning Lake. The preservation team had set up floodlights and perimeter tape around the bus, but no one touched it until I gave the word. We'd pulled enough soil back to see the full frame now, long and narrow, still chained at the door like it had been sealed on purpose. I stayed quiet as they finished their prep. There was a weight to the air I couldn't shake, like something was waiting for us to get it wrong. The first steps inside were cautious. The air smelled like wet fabric and rusted metal, but underneath that was something else, something old, like the smell of closed-up churches or hymnals left in the heat too long. I stepped past the front seats, careful not to brush anything. Most of the interior was intact, dust moss, a few vines. But under the third row, where I'd found the satchel, there was more. A journal badly water-damaged with a name inside that wasn't on the original passenger list. Sister C. Holloway, Our Lady of the Hollow Pines, 1972. I took it home with me that night. My office was too sterile, too loud with its hum of machines and overhead lights. I needed to sit with it. The journal entries started out like you'd expect: prayers, kitchen duties, quiet reflections on obedience and simplicity. Then, somewhere around the middle, the tone changed. There were strange notations, lines like, "He watches even in silence," or "We passed the same curve 3 times. No one corrected her. Then the last entry, July 8th. "We were told not to speak, but he listens anyway, even through the veil." That was the day they vanished. I submitted a formal request to the diocese for access to any restricted material from that year. I didn't expect an answer, but sometimes with the church you don't need permission, you just need to know who to ask. Jude, the archive clerk, met me at the elevator the next day with a single box already in hand. "You called about the Hollow Pines disappearance," he said, like he'd been expecting me. Inside were personnel files: Sisters Marguerite, Lena, Hester, Claire, Josephine, Ruth, Naima, and Odell. 8 names. No C.L. Holloway. But on the corner of one of the pages, barely visible unless it hit the light just right, was a note in pencil. +1. Transit crossed into silence, logged under voice. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt it in my chest the second I read it. The next folder held photos. One in particular caught my eye, a black and white of the monastery courtyard, the last photo taken before the bus left. 8 young women lined up, satchels in hand veils down, and off to the side, behind the others, a 9th figure. She wasn't holding a bag. Her habit was darker, her belt tied in a cross rather than a loop, and her sleeves were long enough to just barely show the mark on her wrist. I pulled out my magnifier. It was faint, but it was the same symbol Sister Miriam had described: a cross, but not the usual kind. The arms bent inward like roots folding into themselves. The Listening Cross. The next name that surfaced was Father Marcus Elroy, listed as the driver. But his name had been struck through twice. In the margin, someone had written, "No formal ordination. Substitute arranged outside normal channels." The church had no record of him, no parish placement, just a name on a route that didn't exist on any diocesan map. I stayed late at the archive that night, staring at those files. I don't know why I opened the last folder last. It was heavier than the others. Inside was a single piece of etched glass like a photographic plate. 9 figures kneeling in a circle, one standing at the center. At their feet, a carved circle split by a vertical line, a seal. Above them, one word repeated 3 times, Silentia. At the bottom, the date July 7th, 1972, the day before they left. Jude came back in with fresh coffee, and when he saw what I was holding, he stopped. "That's the benediction drawing," he said. "Same image has been found 3 other times, always after a convent disappearance. No explanation." I asked him what happened to the people who asked too many questions. He didn't smile. They don't stay in the church long. I took the photo of the 9th woman, the one who stood apart, and pinned it next to the journal on my wall. Then I typed her name into the diocesan portal, Sister C.L. Holloway. Benediction Order, Northern California, active 1970 to 1973. Nothing came up. I broadened the search to include non-vowed staff and affiliates. This time 1 hit, a scan of an old intake form, half redacted. Name Cassie L.H. Classification Observer. Assigned to Crescent County Trial Implementation Phase. Status file sealed by Provincial Authority 1973. Annotation retained under voice clearance only. There was that phrase again, voice. It was well after midnight when I found myself in the county cathedral's sub-basement, the old records chapel most people forgot existed. The stairs down creaked under my weight. I'd been given a name by a janitor once, a room supposedly reserved for items too sacred for general record. I figured it was just local myth. But the key I'd found earlier fit the lock. It was small stone walls, 1 wooden altar, no windows. And there, tucked under a bench, was a box. Inside 4 unlabeled cassette tapes, each marked with a Roman numeral. And a note. These are not confessions. They are echoes. Back at my desk, I loaded the first one. The sound was faint, almost too soft to pick up. A woman's voice. We began with silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. That's what she told us, Sister Ciel. That silence is not absence, it's anticipation. Something is always listening back. The tape crackled. When we knelt, we were told not to close our eyes, not to pray, just wait until it arrived. I don't know what we invited, only that it never left. I shut it off. My hand was steady, but my ribs felt tight. I waited a moment, then played the second. Another voice, younger, shaky. Sister Claire cried during the 3rd night. She said the woods were whispering our names, and not with the right voices. Pause. She left. Said she was done. But she came back. At dawn. Changed. Wouldn't speak. But she wrote. She kept writing. I think she was writing down what it told her. Tape 3 was calmer, almost clinical. Father Elroy didn't drive. Not really. He sat at the wheel, but she stood beside him. CL. She guided. Said the road had already been chosen. that there were no roads where we went, just turns. A map for God. By the time I played the fourth tape, the sun was almost up. "I'm not afraid anymore," the voice said, "because I think I'm already gone." My name, a skip in the audio, was Sister Naima. If you find this, don't listen to the silence. It's not empty. It remembers you. It calls you by your oldest name, the one no one else knows. And once you hear it, you kneel. That's how it starts. When the tape ended, it left a hiss in the speakers that didn't sound like static. It sounded like breath. I turned off the recorder and sat still. I didn't know if I was meant to find those tapes, but I knew I couldn't unhear what was on them. I opened my notebook, wrote one sentence in the margin, the benediction. Silence wasn't a ceremony, it was a response. Then I underlined one word. Naima. She'd said her name, one of the original 8. A woman who shouldn't have been able to speak, telling me not to kneel, not to listen. But what if someone already had? And what if they never stopped? The following morning, I brought what I had to the diocese office. Not formally, just a quiet conversation in the hallway with one of the archivists I'd known for years. I didn't show him the tapes or mention the 9th sister directly, just asked if there were any internal records or memorandums from July 1972 that hadn't made it into the public file. He shook his head before I even finished the question. Said all materials from that year were sealed following an incident review, and even he didn't have the clearance to open them. When I asked who did, he gave me a look I'd seen before somewhere between pity and caution and said nothing. The message was clear. Don't push. Later that day, I submitted a formal inquiry to the state-level office under the Historical Investigation Clause. 3 hours later, it was denied. No explanation. No callback, just a red-stamped rejection with insufficient grounds typed across the top. That's when I started making calls not as a sheriff, but just as someone trying to understand how 8 women could disappear under church supervision and be forgotten for half a century. Most of the people I reached out to said the same thing: they didn't know about the retreat, or they remembered hearing something vague, but nothing official. A few gave me names of former clergy who might have been around back then, but most had either passed or retired without forwarding addresses. One priest who'd served in Humboldt County in the early 70s paused when I asked about the benediction order. "That's not something you want to dig around in?" he said. They didn't talk to the press. They didn't talk to outsiders. Some of us didn't even know they were still active. I tried going back through the personnel files we had cross-referencing student records from Our Lady of the Hollow Pines with Benedictine transport rosters from that year. But the numbers didn't line up. There were missing transit forms, bed assignments with no names, and a dispatch record that noted the bus's departure but not its return. I checked regional law enforcement logs for that week. No crash, no weather report. No missing persons bulletin filed. It was as if the event had been scrubbed clean before anyone had a chance to react. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a case that slipped through the cracks. It had been quietly folded up and put away. When I asked around the station about reopening the file, one of my deputies gave me a quiet pull aside, told me not to waste resources on something the church had already handled. He didn't say it with malice, just resignation. Like it wasn't his to question. That night I walked past the holding room where we kept unsolved case boards, and I realized how many of them never got answers. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the people who might have known the truth had already decided not to share it. I drove home without the radio on, just listening to the wind come through the cracks in the window. The tapes were still in my desk. I hadn't listened to them again. The next day, I stopped by to see Miriam Holloway. She was out by the small garden behind her cabin, trimming back a few vines that had overtaken her window. She didn't look surprised to see me. I didn't bring a badge. I didn't need one. I held out the photo of the monastery courtyard, the one with the 8 postulants and the 9th figure in the shadows. She looked at it for a long time before speaking. She wasn't meant to be in the photo, she said. She never stood with the others, not unless she was watching. I asked if it was Ciel. Miriam nodded once. She didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. Inside the house, she showed me something I hadn't seen before, a small notebook bound with linen thread. She didn't explain how she still had it. Didn't say if it had been hers or passed down. But when I opened it, the drawings matched the carvings from the listening cross. Symbols, circular, spiraling inward, some jagged like branches, others clean like music notations. At the back of the notebook, one line written in a different hand. The silence is not what follows the voice. It is what prepares it. I asked Miriam what that meant. She poured tea before answering. We weren't supposed to speak during the retreat, she said, not just as a vow. It was instruction. The silence made space for something else. I asked what that something else was. She didn't reply right away, just said, "We were told not to name it. That giving it form made it stronger." I left shortly after, but her words followed me home. That night I went back to the tapes. This time I listened to the last few minutes again. Naima's voice, the one who said she thought she was already gone, had a strange calm to it. Not resigned, not fearful, just distant, like someone speaking from another room. She said, "It remembers you. It calls you by your oldest name." I didn't know what that meant, but the way she said it stuck with me. Like maybe names weren't about identification. Maybe they were about belonging. The next morning, I filed a quiet request to the county's Historical Preservation Fund to have the bus site sealed from public access. Not closed off entirely, just protected while we sorted out jurisdiction. I listed the request under pending investigation, ecclesiastical archive coordination. It passed without much pushback. Most people were too focused on the drought and the headlines to notice. A week passed. The phone stopped ringing. The county moved on. And still no official inquiry came down from the church. No calls from the bishop's office, no statement. Just silence. And not the kind that means no one's talking. The kind that feels arranged, held in place, like something waiting just outside of language. Then late one evening, a letter showed up at the station. No return address. Postmarked locally. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. No signature. It read, "She was never meant to kneel. That's why she remembered. That's why you're hearing this now." There was no name, no mention of who sent it. But tucked into the envelope was a torn piece of fabric, same weave as the cloth found under the bus seat. On it, stitched in silver thread, was the same symbol. The cross that bends inward. The one they said marked those chosen not to speak, but to listen. I kept the letter in my desk, didn't log it, didn't report it, just folded it back into the envelope and waited. Because if someone was trying to warn me, it meant we hadn't reached the end of this thing. Not even close. I didn't tell anyone about the letter, not right away. I kept it folded in my desk drawer beneath the photo of the bus and the map of Crescent County. Every now and then I'd take it out just to reread the last line. "That's why you're hearing this now." I didn't know what it meant, not really, but I'd been sleeping lighter since the discovery at Morning Lake. Dreaming more too. Nothing vivid, just the feeling of walking through narrow halls where the doors never opened, where someone was always just out of sight. That kind of dream doesn't scare you, it waits. And when you wake up, it lingers. By the end of the week, the phone had stopped ringing. The bus had been cataloged. The files were sealed again. People had moved on. But I hadn't. I couldn't. I kept thinking about the tapes, about Sister Naima's voice saying her name wasn't hers anymore, about Claire writing things she was told not to remember, about that phrase that kept coming back, voice clearance. I sat in my office long after closing the windows dark, the town quiet. I started pulling old diocesan rosters again, this time from smaller parishes in the region. Not just the convents or the seminary records, everything. I broadened my search to include anyone affiliated with non-vowed silence rites, even though I wasn't sure what that meant. Most of what I got were empty fields, redacted lines, or forms with names listed only by initials. But there was one hit, an address filed under Observer Transfer Temporary Housing. It wasn't from the Benedictine order. It was from a rural parish tucked up near the border, the kind that doesn't show up on standard GPS, the kind you only find if you already know where it is. The name on the file, Father Elias Holloway. I made the drive the next day. Gravel roads, long rows of pine mailboxes so rusted they folded under their own weight. The rectory was small, low-roofed with ivy curling up the porch beams and a wind chime that hadn't moved in a while. I knocked once, then twice. The man who opened the door looked older than the record suggested, not just in age, but in a way that made it seem like he'd carried too many years in silence. His voice was soft, almost dry. "You're the sheriff," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I'd like to ask you about a name," I said. "Cassie, L.H." He didn't blink, just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. Inside the room smelled like dust and old paper. Books lined every wall, thin ones, thick ones, spines worn flat most on liturgy or early church tradition. The only sound was a kettle heating slowly on a coil burner. He sat down without asking my reason. "She stayed here," he said. "Winter of 1970. Came barefoot, carrying nothing but a jar of salt and a piece of driftwood." I asked how long she'd stayed. He said long enough to leave something behind. Then he reached under a low shelf and pulled out a box. Inside was a stack of old letters, unaddressed, yellowed at the edges. Beneath them, a sketchbook. The pages were filled with charcoal drawings. Some abstract spirals, root systems, outlines of hands held palm up. Others were clearer. A woman standing in the center of a kneeling circle, a stone seal split by a vertical line, a tree with a hollow trunk and something crouched inside it. And then one page near the back, darker, more deliberate. A face mouth closed not by thread, but by something that looked like branches stitched across in silence. Below it, in small writing, "We are quiet so that others can hear." I turned the page. Another image. A figure kneeling inside a ring of carved stones. Her hands resting on her knees. Her eyes wide open. A tree behind her. And just above the tree, a small mark. Not a shape. A mouth. Wide, watching. I asked him what she'd told him back then. Father Elias stared at the drawing a long time. She said she wasn't there to teach, he said. She was there to remember, and that the church had forgotten what silence was for. He paused. She didn't mean reverence. She meant reception. I asked where she went. He said the last time he saw her was 2 days before the retreat. She stood in the chapel, he said, staring at the crucifix. But she wasn't praying. She was listening. And then she stepped through the pine gate. Didn't take a bag. Didn't say goodbye. Just walked into the woods. On the way back, I didn't take the main road. I took the old timber route, the one that led past what used to be the retreat center at Hollow Pines. Nothing stood there anymore, just the ruins of the old archway and the slope where the chapel had once been. I parked near the tree line and stepped out. The forest was still. No birds, no wind, no scent of moisture in the air. Just pine and quiet. I walked a little farther than I meant to. Found myself at the edge of a clearing I didn't recognize. Small stones marked the perimeter, not arranged, but natural, like they'd been placed by something that didn't use hands. And there, leaning against the base of a pine, was a wooden sign. Weathered, faded, barely readable. But the words were still there. The listening garden. And beneath that, leave your voice. Take only what listens. I didn't step past the edge. I just stood there, watching the way the branches curled above the path, the way the grass didn't grow in the center, the way everything around that place seemed to lean in, not to look but to hear. And I remembered what Naima had said on the tape. Once you hear it, you kneel. I turned back before the light changed, drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let the scent of pine in. That night I sat with the sketchbook open on my kitchen table. The last page had something I hadn't noticed before. Faint handwriting in the margin. Claire wrote it down, it said. She shouldn't have. I traced the name with my finger. Sister Claire, one of the 8. One who'd left, then come back. One who'd stopped speaking. One who kept writing even after the others went silent. The next morning, I called Miriam again. Asked her plainly, did Claire survive? There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, that depends on what you mean by survive. I didn't ask her to explain. I just let the silence hold. It didn't feel empty. It felt full, like someone somewhere was waiting for the right question, and that I hadn't asked it yet. I returned to the archive the following morning with a quiet determination to look closer at the clues that no one else seemed to notice. The cloth I'd found beneath the bus seat, the one embroidered with Claire's name, had stayed with me. Underneath the familiar stitches, I had never examined the tiny symbols woven into the fabric's edge. Now, with a magnifying glass borrowed from the preservation team, I turned it slowly in the light. The markings were strange, curved shapes and lines that didn't match any alphabet I knew. They matched the carvings on the so-called listening cross I'd seen in the old chapel sketchbook. That symbol, the one that bent inward like roots curling beneath the earth, had appeared again and again, woven into almost every piece of evidence I uncovered. I began cross-referencing those symbols with the scattered notes I'd collected, scribbled pages from Claire's hidden journals, the etched glass with the 9 figures kneeling in a circle, the faded archival photographs. It felt like I was staring at a secret language. A code meant not to be read aloud but understood in silence. I brought the cloth and papers back to Miriam's cabin that afternoon. She didn't flinch when I laid them out before her, only nodded slowly as if confirming something she'd long suspected but never spoken. "They were never meant to kneel," she said quietly. "Not all of them. Some were chosen to watch, to listen." Her voice trembled just slightly, not with fear but with the weight of memory. She told me Claire had been the first to resist refusing to bow when instructed, the only one brave enough to keep her eyes open and record what she heard. She carried the silence in a way no one else could, and she paid for it. She gestured toward the worn notebook I'd brought, the pages filled with fragmented, feverish writings. That was Claire's voice, her witness. I spent that night going through every scrap of Claire's writing I could find, piecing together fragments of a ritual that seemed less like prayer and more like a rite of listening to something that should never be heard. The notes mentioned the garden, a place hidden deep in the woods where voices gathered in the dark and names were whispered that weren't their own. Claire wrote about the weight of silence and the cost of bearing it. "We do not kneel to silence," she'd scribbled in one note. "We hold it." The next day, following the faint directions from Claire's notes, I found myself on a narrow dirt path deep in the forest outside Crescent County. The air was heavy and still, the pines tall and unyielding. After walking for what felt like miles, the trees suddenly opened to a small clearing ringed with stones, each post carved with shallow indentations where someone might kneel. 8 of them, worn and weathered but unmistakable. And beside them a 9th space left hollow as if for someone who never knelt. At the center stood a broken stone pedestal etched with Latin words, Silentium loquitur. Silence speaks. Beneath it a phrase I couldn't translate, written in a script that twisted like it was alive. I crouched to the base and found a rusted tin box sealed with twine and wax. Inside was a thin booklet bound in red thread and titled The Benediction Rite, prepared and recorded by Sister C.L. Holloway herself. I sat on the cold stone, turning the pages slowly. Sparse words, sentences spaced with blankness, a deliberate silence between lines. The rite was not a blessing, but a stillness, an offering to listen, not to speak. The diagram of the kneeling figures was there with the 9th standing apart, watching. Beneath it a warning repeated thrice. Do not speak the name that calls from the garden. The last pages were fragments, Claire's hurried notes, the chilling admission that the silence was never ours. We only carried it. I closed the booklet and let the wind move through the clearing like a whisper no one else could hear. Back at the station, I pinned the booklet next to the photo of the kneeling sisters on my evidence board and wrote beneath it, "The benediction rite was not a moment. It was a seed." Underlined, I added a single name, Claire. Later that morning, Miriam appeared on the sheriff's office porch, holding a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside was a brass key and a scrap of paper with an address, Crescent Pines Storage Unit 4A. She told me it held what Claire had tried to hide. That afternoon, I drove out to the storage facility. The roll-up door was rusted and groaned as I unlocked it with the brass key. Inside, just one item, a worn writing desk with locked drawers. One drawer had a keyhole matching the brass key. I spent hours sorting through the papers inside dozens of handwritten pages, some torn from hymnals, others plain and unlined. Each page was a record, a message, a translation. They contained names, symbols, instructions, and one phrase repeated over and over. He listens through us, not to us. Beneath the stack, I found a photograph. It showed a circle of women kneeling in a clearing, their faces blank and mouths open but silent. At the center, a tall woman stood apart, hands raised not in blessing but in stillness. I turned the photo over. Faint pencil handwriting read, "The moment just before the rain fell." I traced the woman's face with my thumb. It wasn't CL. It wasn't Claire. It was someone else. Someone who wasn't on any roster, any list, any official record. Miriam called her the anchor, the one who bore the silence when the others couldn't. She wasn't part of the right, Miriam said softly. She was what the right was built around. That night, back at the station, I reread Claire's hidden writings again. The fragments spoke of voices not to be heard, of silence that remembers, and of those who carry it forward. He didn't take us by force. One note read, he didn't have to. We were already listening. Claire's words ended with a haunting image. When I close my eyes, I see a door. Through it, I hear the ones who didn't kneel. They're still singing. The bus was gone, lifted from the lake bed and moved to a secure preservation site. But the place where it had rested was a wound in the earth that refused to close. I stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at a stone ring the forensic team had uncovered beneath the bus, a circle etched with 9 points. One of them was darker than the rest, a bearing stone carved with the listening cross, split like an open door. That night, I examined a photograph found wedged inside the bus chassis, sealed away for decades. It showed a group of women in plain clothes seated around a campfire. Their faces were wide-eyed, their expressions unreadable. But one woman stood apart, looking straight at the camera, not with fear, but with knowing. She had no name on the back, just a phrase faded with time. She stayed because she remembered. I laid the photo before Miriam and Elias Holloway at the hospital. Miriam nodded, her eyes glistening with a soft certainty. "That's the anchor," she said. The one Claire called the anchor. The one who bore the silence. No one had ever officially acknowledged her existence. She was the quiet center the others depended on, the keeper of the boundary between silence and voice. I closed the case file, but it wasn't closed. Not really. Some prayers never reach heaven. They stay here. They wait. Sometimes they're answered not with miracles, but with memory. It was hard to walk away from that stone ring beneath the lake bed even after the forensic team had wrapped up and gone home. Something about it stayed with me, a kind of quiet pressure I could still feel long after leaving the site. The symbols carved into those stones matched everything I'd uncovered: Claire's journal entries, the embroidered cloth, the sketches, even the whispered warnings. I'd been looking at all of it separately, piece by piece, but now it felt like one picture slowly coming into focus. The answer wasn't back at the station or buried in old records. It was somewhere closer, hidden right here beneath decades of silence. Later that day, when the sun was low enough to cast the pines in long shadows, I drove back out to the woods near Hollow Pines. The gravel road seemed narrower this time, the trees taller and closer together. The air felt dense, like the quiet after rain, only there hadn't been a drop for weeks. I parked at the edge of the path and stepped out slowly. Birds had stopped singing. Even the wind had quieted down, like it was holding its breath along with me. The path was almost invisible now, barely wide enough to follow. It wound through a tangle of roots and brambles leading deeper into the shadows of the forest. Soon I was walking in near darkness, guided only by the fading twilight and the shapes of the trees around me. Then, just as I started to wonder if I'd gone too far, the path widened slightly. Ahead of me, the trees opened into a small clearing. I recognized it immediately from Claire's sketches, a wide circle ringed by worn wooden posts embedded in the ground, each carved shallowly at the top, as if shaped to hold someone kneeling. There were 8 of them, all exactly the same. But there, slightly off to one side, was a 9th spot empty, just grass, worn thin in the shape of footprints, as if someone had always stood rather than knelt. I moved carefully toward the center, where a broken stone pedestal sat cracked and covered in moss. Carved into its surface were the words, "Silentium loquitur," "Silence speaks," and beneath them another word I didn't recognize, "Kala." Just below the inscription, tucked against the stone's base, was a small rusted tin box. It looked as if it had waited there for decades. I knelt down to open it, feeling the hinges creak softly as the lid lifted. Inside was a thin booklet neatly bound with faded red thread. Its cover was worn, the handwriting small and meticulous, "The Benediction Rite," authored by Sister C.L. Holloway. I flipped gently through the brittle pages. Each one contained only sparse lines, almost poetic, but strangely detached. One page read, "The rite is not to sanctify, but to still. We listen not for answers, but to become questions." Beneath these lines, the same image I'd seen before, the circle of kneeling figures, with one standing separate lines radiating outward, connecting all to her. Underneath it, a warning was repeated 3 times, growing heavier with each line. "Do not speak the name that calls from the garden." The final 2 pages of the booklet were fragmented, urgent scribbles clearly written later by another hand. Claire's hand. One line stood out starkly. Claire wrote it down. She shouldn't have. And below it, quieter, as if written almost in resignation, "The silence was never ours. We only carried it." I set the booklet back in the box carefully and stood up, feeling the quiet around me now as something alive, aware, almost watchful. I turned to retrace my steps, but stopped when I heard a faint rustle behind me, not loud, just enough to make me pause. I turned again slowly, my eyes drawn down another narrow path I hadn't noticed earlier, leading out of the clearing and deeper into the woods. It was barely wide enough for one person, thick with brambles and shadow. I hesitated, but the quiet pushed at me, pulling me gently forward. 10 feet down that path, hidden partly by overgrown brush, was something else, a stone structure built into the base of a rocky slope. Not exactly an altar, not quite a stage, more like a raised platform of weathered stone. Above it, carved deeply and neatly, were words in Latin, "Silentium loquitur," "Silence speaks." Below it again, etched faintly, was that same word, "Kala." On top of the platform, in plain sight, sat another small metal box, sealed shut with wax and twine. It opened easily in my hands, revealing another handful of pages. These were Claire's missing writings, the ones Miriam said she'd hidden away. They were hurriedly written, urgent and fearful. Claire described voices coming from nowhere, names spoken aloud without tongues, people who'd knelt silently but heard screaming inside their heads. She wrote, "He didn't take us by force. He didn't have to. We were already listening." The last note she'd left behind was short, clear, and heartbreaking. "If they find the bus, they'll find the garden. And if they find the garden, they'll find what we left to keep the door closed." I stood motionless for a long moment, listening. The silence around me felt full and expectant, no longer peaceful, but patiently waiting. As I turned back toward the path, my flashlight caught something small and faint, partially buried in dirt at the edge of the platform. It was a bracelet, small and plastic, faded purple. Childlike lettering etched into its surface spelled out, "Kimmy." I picked it up gently and brushed the dirt away with my thumb. It seemed out of place, oddly fragile amid the quiet stone and darkness. I didn't know who Kimmy was yet, but her name lingered heavily in my mind as I placed the bracelet carefully in my pocket. As I walked back through the woods toward my car, the darkness seemed softer, almost forgiving now, but still waiting as if it knew I'd found something that wasn't meant to be lost. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The silence said enough. The bracelet with Kimmy's name stayed in my pocket all the way back to the station, its quiet presence heavier than I'd expected. I laid it carefully on my desk and sat down slowly. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me, the only sound in the room. I didn't need records to tell me who Kimmy might have been. There was already something about the small, faded bracelet that spoke volumes. I spent that evening rereading Claire's hidden pages now laid out across my desk. Her notes spoke of a ritual I still didn't fully grasp, and of a voice they'd all heard, a voice that had called to them from silence. The pages described a feeling of being slowly emptied, as if their very thoughts were gently replaced by something else. Claire wrote how they'd begun to forget their own names, how they whispered new ones in the dark names they hadn't known they possessed. Yet the final note she left was unmistakably clear. Kimmy stayed behind, so no one else would have to kneel. The phrase stayed with me as I drove home that night. In the darkened kitchen, I made coffee more out of habit than thirst. My mind kept circling the image of the listening garden and the small clearing hidden in the trees. There was something I'd missed, some detail hidden in plain sight. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it brought only quiet dreams. Dreams of being back at the lake bed, standing at the stone circle, hearing my own name whispered by voices without faces. I woke before sunrise, still thinking about Claire's last message. When I arrived back at the office, the preservation team was already waiting for me, their expressions guarded but expectant. The team leader approached cautiously, holding out a set of photographs. He told me they'd returned to the lake after removing the bus frame to document everything thoroughly for the county records. As he handed me the photos, he hesitated slightly, adding that they'd found something unexpected. Beneath the stone circle, where the ground had been worn away, was a sealed entrance, a hidden chamber beneath the lake bed itself. It was small, they said, about the size of a quiet room carefully concealed by bolts rusted shut from years underwater. But what troubled them most was that the bolts had clearly been unlocked, and from the inside. I followed the team back to the site in silence. The early morning air was sharp cold and perfectly still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They had already opened the entrance when I arrived, revealing a narrow passage down into darkness. Carefully, without conversation, we descended. The chamber below was bare, empty of furniture except for a single wooden chair placed exactly in the center. Beside it on the stone floor lay another small box similar to the ones I'd found earlier. I crouched down to open it, feeling the air grow still around me. Inside was nothing but dust and another faded piece of fabric carefully folded. When I unfolded it, I saw words stitched neatly in silver thread, the same looping handwriting I'd now come to recognize as Claire's. The message was simple, but chilling. Some were chosen to remain. They guard what listens. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room heavier than before. That was when I saw it etched faintly into the stone directly beneath the chair. A single familiar symbol, the listening cross, but this time it was split down the middle like an open doorway. I climbed back up to the surface without speaking, feeling the quiet gaze of the preservation crew on me as I emerged into daylight. Back at the station, I gathered Claire's pages again, placing them next to Kimmy's bracelet and the cloth I'd found beneath the lake. All the pieces fit together too neatly. Now the hidden chamber, the split symbol, the phrase Claire had written, "We carried the silence, so no one else would have to." And yet, something still felt unresolved, unfinished, like a sentence trailing off. Late that night, as I sat alone, trying to make sense of everything I'd uncovered, the phone rang, startling me. Miriam's voice on the other end was quiet, almost gentle. She said she had remembered something more, something Claire had told her the night before the retreat. Claire had been afraid Miriam said not of silence itself, but of what it concealed, the voice that came from somewhere beneath their prayers, behind their careful rituals. She said it was never about humility, Miriam whispered softly. It was about agreeing to listen to something we never should have heard. I asked Miriam if Claire had ever mentioned Kimmy. After a pause, she told me Claire said Kimmy had spoken only once during the entire retreat, just one quiet sentence. "I'll stay if it means no one else has to kneel again." Miriam's voice cracked just slightly as she said it, but her tone remained steady. Claire believed Kimmy had been chosen from the start to bear whatever silence they'd welcomed in. After we ended the call, I stood in the dim light of my office, feeling a gentle pressure settle over me. The bracelet on my desk caught my eye again, the childish letters standing out clearly against faded plastic. It wasn't just a bracelet anymore. It was proof of something deeper, an agreement made quietly, willingly in the dark. The preservation team had left for good, sealing off the lake site permanently. No further investigation had been authorized, no formal explanation given to the public. But none of that mattered, because now I knew that some truths weren't meant for official reports or press statements. They were simply meant to be carried forward quietly by someone who'd listened and understood. Before I left the station that night, I placed Kimmy's bracelet carefully in the drawer alongside the faded cloth and the pages Claire had hidden away. I locked the drawer softly, turned out the lights, and stepped into the stillness outside. The silence around me was gentle now, almost comforting, as if reassuring me that even if I hadn't found every answer yet, I had found enough. I had found their voices. And for the first time I understood clearly that my role had shifted, not just investigator anymore, but witness, someone who heard who carried forward what others had chosen to keep silent. I left knowing the story wasn't finished yet. Something still waited out there patiently beneath the quiet darkness. But now, at least, I knew how to listen. In the days following the discovery of the underground chamber, everything moved quietly and deliberately. Officially, the case was closed again, marked simply as a historical anomaly, neatly filed away as something we'd never fully explain. But unofficially, nothing about it felt resolved. There was still a quiet tension in the air, a lingering unease that hung like mist after the rain. I returned to the lake one more time before they sealed off the site for good. It was late afternoon, the sky muted with clouds, the trees watching silently from the shoreline. I stood where the bus had rested for decades, The earth still scarred a circle etched faintly in the dried mud. As I turned to leave, one of the preservation techs called my name quietly. He handed me a final photograph they'd uncovered, carefully sealed in protective plastic. It had been hidden deep within the bus's frame, placed deliberately as if meant for someone specific to find. The photo showed a group of young women, their faces serene yet distant eyes turned towards something out of frame. Among them stood one woman slightly apart, her posture different, her gaze direct and calm. She wore no veil or habit, just plain clothes, and she was staring straight at the camera, not with alarm but with recognition, as if she had always known someone would eventually see her. I recognized her instantly. It was the same face I'd seen before, the one Miriam had quietly referred to as the anchor, the one Claire had hinted at in her hidden notes. Turning the photo over, I saw faint handwriting in pencil. She stayed because she remembered. I didn't linger at the lake after that. I drove slowly back into town, the roads empty, the world around me hushed and expectant. At the station, I went directly to my office and placed the photograph carefully on my desk beside Kimmy's bracelet and the cloth with Claire's name. The pieces were all here now, small, quiet clues that spoke louder than words, each one carrying fragments of a story that wasn't yet complete. Later that afternoon, I sat down with Miriam again. She was quieter than usual, her eyes steady but tired, as if the story we'd uncovered was a weight she'd carried far longer than anyone knew. I showed her the photograph from the bus, placing it gently on the table between us. She studied it carefully, then nodded softly in recognition. "That's the one Claire called the anchor," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never knelt. She was the one who carried the silence. The others knelt because of her." I asked Miriam if she remembered a name, if the anchor had ever been called anything else. Miriam shook her head slowly. She wasn't part of the group. She wasn't listed anywhere. She was always there, just separate from everyone else, like something necessary but never named. I let her words settle into the silence between us, absorbing their weight carefully. Before I left, Miriam touched my arm gently and said, "Whatever you find, just remember it's not about solving something. It's about knowing. Knowing is enough." I returned to the archives one last time that evening, this time alone without anyone else watching or waiting. The lights buzzed softly overhead as I laid out all the documents again, spreading Claire's notes, Miriam's memories, and the photographs across the table. Everything pointed back to the same quiet truth. This had never been about a missing bus or even the retreat itself. It was about the voices carried forward, the silence they'd chosen to bear the unspoken promise to keep something contained. Among Claire's final notes was one phrase underlined twice: "We do not kneel for silence, we hold it." And beside it, in smaller, tighter handwriting, she'd added quietly, "Kimmy understood first. She was chosen because she listened better." The words resonated gently in the empty room. Before leaving, I carefully packed everything away into the box I'd brought, sealing it quietly, placing it safely on the highest shelf. Not as evidence, but as a record, a quiet acknowledgement that some truths remain unfinished, intentionally kept just beyond reach. In the days afterward, the town settled into routine again. People went back to work, back to church, back to conversations that steered carefully away from anything difficult or unexplained. No official statement ever came from the diocese beyond a brief acknowledgement, just a quiet, cautious memorial held at St. Catherine's Church, subtle enough that no one outside Crescent County noticed. But I did. I sat in the back pew unnoticed, watching the ceremony unfold quietly, respectfully, without fanfare. It was a ceremony for closure, without ever using that word, a recognition without naming what they were acknowledging. Afterward, I returned home in silence, the quiet weight of the truth still resting carefully on my shoulders. That night's sleep didn't come easily again. But instead of dreaming about darkness or confusion, I dreamt clearly, calmly of the small garden clearing and the soft voices whispering from the trees, not threatening, not angry, just patiently speaking, knowing that someone was finally listening. When I woke, the morning felt quiet in a new way, softer somehow, less tense. Outside, the trees moved gently, the sky brightening slowly with dawn. I made coffee and sat at the table quietly absorbing everything that had unfolded over the weeks. I remembered Miriam's words clearly, that knowing was enough, and realized she was right. Sometimes the hardest stories aren't meant to be solved. They're just meant to be carried forward quietly and carefully by those who've learned how to listen. Still, even as I sat there, calm and clear-headed, something gently nudged at the edges of my memory, a feeling that there was still something I'd missed, something overlooked carefully tucked just beyond my reach. And then I remembered Claire's final scribbled line, one I'd dismissed at first as too fragmented to understand. She'd written, "He didn't take us by force, he didn't have to. We listened willingly, and once we heard he stayed." The realization settled slowly and quietly over me, not frightening, just acknowledging. I set my coffee down gently, noticing for the first time how perfectly silent the room had become, and understood clearly that even now this wasn't finished yet. Something still waited patiently, softly at the edges of this story. Not hidden, just quiet like a voice waiting calmly for its turn to speak. Standing at the edge of Morning Lake, where the cracked earth still holds the ghost of the bus's resting place, I feel the weight of everything that's happened settle around me like the slow return of the mist. The bus is gone now, lifted to a preservation facility far from here, encased behind glass and steel out of sight, but never forgotten. But the ground where it once lay remains open, scarred in a way that no rain or time seems to fully heal. It's a wound left open, a silence that refuses to fade. Some wounds I've come to understand don't close. They just wait for us to listen. I think about the women 8 who vanished and the 9th who stayed behind. Claire, Kimmy, Ciel, and the anchor. Names I say quietly with care because they deserve to be spoken, remembered. They were never just victims or mysteries in dusty files. They were people who carried something heavy and sacred, a silence no one else could bear. Some never returned. Others came back changed in ways we can't fully explain. And all of them left behind pieces of themselves, notes, symbols, whispers in places, meant to keep the past alive, even when everyone else tried to bury it. I asked Miriam once if Claire survived, and she gave me an answer I didn't expect. "It depends on what you mean by survive," she said. And now I understand what she meant. Survival isn't always about walking away unscathed or being found. Sometimes survival is about carrying the memory, holding the silence, so others don't have to. It's about bearing the invisible burdens so the rest of us don't have to know. The church never gave us answers. Officially, they moved on, and so did most of the town. But I never did. I kept looking, listening, piecing together what silence they left behind. Justice, if it came, wasn't through indictments or headlines. It was quieter than that. It was in remembering and refusing to forget, in acknowledging what happened even when the truth was tangled in shadows and silence. I carry their stories with me now, not to reopen wounds or stir pain, but to honor what was lost and what was never meant to be lost to time. I've learned that some stories don't end with neat closures or clear answers. They end with memory slow, steady, and real. The kind of memory that sits with you on quiet evenings. The kind that shapes who you are without shouting it out loud. If this story has stayed with you, if it's whispered something you didn't expect or made you pause, I invite you to hold these names gently in your mind. Share them if you can, because no name should be left behind in silence. And sometimes listening is the bravest thing we can do.